Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight you're aboard a 16th century slave ship, drifting across a vast and indifferent ocean, where canvas groans in the wind and the wooden hull breathes with the weight it carries. You're not a captain or a navigator, just a low-ranking sailor moving through the long, heavy hours of a voyage that feels older than memory. Before we start, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair, plus other sleep tools, in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable, let's begin. You wake to the measured groan of timber, the familiar sound rising from the dark like a practiced breath. The planks beneath you shift, not sharply, but with the slow persuasion of a living thing tired of its own movement. Above, a soft shuffle of chains murmurs through the beams, a sound that does not startle you anymore. It blends with the steady heave of water against the hull, the rhythm so constant that it feels less like a noise and more like the background pulse of your existence. You blink against the dimness. The lantern in the corner has burned itself into a small orange bead, barely enough to lift the shadows from the boards. Its light stretches in thin strips, revealing dust drifting through the air in tired spirals. Everything looks the same as it did when your eyes last closed, though you cannot remember exactly when that was. Time on this ship does not behave like time on land. It stretches, folds, dissolves. It repeats without pattern. The only thing that seems to remember how to move forward is the vessel itself, dragging the days along behind it like a net of indistinguishable moments. You push yourself upright, feeling the stiffness in your back resist for a second before giving way. The air tastes of old salt and damp hemp, with a faint undercurrent of something metallic, like water left too long in a bucket. You inhale slowly, letting the scent settle. It never leaves, no matter how many mornings. If these dim passages can be called mornings, unfold in the same muted hues. The ship carries its own weather, its own atmosphere, thick and unchanged. You know without looking that most of the crew is already awake, or at least operating in that limbo between waking and working, where the body has not yet caught up to consciousness, but the motions have already begun. The ship encourages this state. It nudges you into it with its restless boards and endless duties. Sleep is something that happens in small pieces here, scattered and shallow, easily brushed aside by the slightest shift of weight or whisper of rope. You reach for your boots. The leather is stiff with dried seawater, cracking slightly near the tops. They slide on without effort, shaped long ago to the tired curve of your feet. When you stand, you can feel the tilt of the deck under your arches, a slow, familiar rocking, as though the world insists on reminding you that solid ground is something you must not expect anymore. The corridor outside your quarters is narrow, illuminated only by what little light can creep through the cracks in the boards above. You make your way along it, stepping around coils of rope left ready for use. Your hand grazes the wall as you walk, fingertips brushing the grain of the wood. It feels older each day, worn by hands exactly like yours, by years of salt and sweat, by an unbroken chain of routine. Up the ladder, the deck greets you with its cold air. A thin layer of mist presses against the horizon, softening the boundary between sea and sky until the two seem to merge. The light has not fully arrived yet. It lingers below the clouds, a pale glow that suggests morning without offering any true warmth. The ship moves through it with slow certainty, parting the water with a sound that resembles breathing. Long, deep, resigned. You stand still for a moment, adjusting to the openness. Your eyes trace the lines of the rigging, the sag of the sails, the shapes of men moving about their tasks. No one speaks unless necessary. Their faces are drawn in quiet concentration, not from urgency, but from the weight of repetition. Each gesture is measured, each step is familiar. The ship has been teaching you all the same lesson since the first day. Efficiency is a kind of silence. You turn toward the stern, where a thin figure leans over the rail, checking the angles of rope that vanish into the water behind you. He does not look up. He does not need to. Everyone knows where everyone else should be at this hour. The arrangement of bodies has become as predictable as the creaking of the masts. Below your feet, faint vibrations travel upward, the shifting of weight in the lower decks. The hold is awake as well, though not by choice. The sound carries differently than the crew's movements. Softer, more controlled, because the space down there is not meant to be loud. It absorbs noise instead of releasing it. You feel it rather than hear it, a dull pressure that settles into your bones. You step toward the bow. The boards here are slick with the remains of last night's spray, glistening in the grey light. You crouch down and run a hand over them, feeling the grain rise beneath your palm. Another passing wave taps the hull, a low, hollow thud that echoes across the deck. The sound is not alarming. It has repeated itself too many times to hold meaning. It becomes another line in the quiet script the ship recites to itself. Water, wood, weight, labour. You straighten, rolling your shoulders. The wind shifts slightly, carrying with it the faint odour of oil and tar. Someone has been working near the barrels again, preparing repairs that never seem urgent, but always seem necessary. The ship wears its maintenance like a uniform. Patched sails, darkened ropes, reinforced planks. Everything functional, nothing graceful. Your gaze moves to the mainmast. A lantern hangs there, its flame flickering weakly in the breeze. It has been burning since well before the night ended, tended in steady intervals, by hands trained not to forget such things. Its glow illuminates the edge of the deck, revealing the uneven surface where heavy boots have trodden for months. The officer on duty stands near the helm, his stance rigid, his expression unreadable in the muted light. He gives a small nod when your eyes meet his, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. He returns to monitoring the horizon, though nothing out there seems likely to change. The sea spreads outward in every direction, not hostile, not welcoming, merely present. Its indifference feels almost comforting. It expects nothing from you. You walk toward the rail, resting your hands on the cold wood. It is smooth in places, splintered in others. The water below shimmers in inconsistent patches, disturbed by the ship's slow progress. You watch it for a while, letting your mind settle into the rhythm of its rise and fall. The movement is steady, always steady, and it anchors your thoughts in a way that sleep no longer can. Behind you, footsteps approach, then pass without pause. A bucket clatters softly, the sound quickly absorbed by the open air. Someone coughs, someone adjusts a rope. These noises form the nearest thing to conversation the morning offers. They fill the space with presence, rather than meaning. The light strengthens little by little, revealing more of the deck's worn surface. Shadows shrink along the beams. The mist thins. The sea brightens to a dull silver. You breathe it in, though the cold stings your throat slightly. This is the ship's version of dawn, slow, subdued, uninterested in spectacle. Even the sun seems reluctant to participate fully, casting thin rays that stretch but never sharpen. As you stand there, the first order of the day drifts across the deck, spoken in the flat tone of someone who has given the same instruction countless times before. It carries no urgency, no emotion. It simply states what must be done, just as the ship states what must be endured. You turn toward the voice automatically, your body already preparing to move. For a moment you feel a small flutter inside your chest, not emotion exactly, but the faint recognition of yourself within all this machinery. It flickers, fragile, then settles into the background, indistinguishable from the rest of the morning's motions. The ship does not sleep, it cannot afford to, and so neither can you, not fully. You belong to its rhythm now, to its endless groan of timber, its muttered chains, its long procession of days that slide across one another without leaving marks. You lift your hand from the railing and step forward, drawn back into the quiet cycle that waits for you. The deck creaks under your weight, steady and familiar, guiding you toward the tasks the morning requires. Everything is already in motion. It always is. You move from the rail as if guided by an invisible schedule, each step already mapped in your bones. The deck narrows beneath your boots. Ropes hang, like the arms of waiting things. The morning smells resolve more clearly now. The sharp tang of tar, the metallic note of old nails, the sour breath of sweat gathered in folds of canvas. You do not catalogue these smells mentally, so much as let them slot into a place inside you reserved for inventory. They are recorded with the same dispassionate efficiency as the knots you tie and the measures you speak aloud. An order reaches you, low and even, carried across the deck by the sound of a voice that has learned to spare its feelings. Rations at first light, it says. The words less a command than a fact of nature aboard this ship. You nod because you have learned to translate nods into commas and verbs in the ongoing sentence of duty. Your pair of hands know what comes next. Securing the stores, fetching the rations, making the counts that turn human need into numbers. You move to the store where barrels are kept swollen with preserved meat and hard biscuit. The lids come off with a practiced tug, the smell of damp grain rising up and filling the narrow space. You lift measuring cups, count scoops, and the motions are tidy and precise. Each portion you ladle is a unit, each scoop an entry that, when summed, becomes the daily arithmetic of survival. There is no flourish in the work. It is a series of small, unremarkable gestures, repeated until they harden into law. A man near you checks a ledger. The paper is damp at the edges, the ink smudged into soft halos where the salt air has reached it. His pen moves in slow, deliberate strokes. He lists numbers, allotments, names reduced to marks and columns. You watch the ink settle and feel a hollow reassurance in the certainty of the marks. When a thing is written down, it is contained. That is the belief the ship fosters, the illusion of control that steadies hands in the face of circumstances that would otherwise be unsteady. You carry a measure to the lower hatch. The mouth of the hold yawns and exhales a warmth that is heavier than the air above. The scent carries with it the faint trace of human bodies, an odour that has been layered and layered until it becomes a base note of the ship itself. For a moment, standing at its threshold, you feel the weight of it press against your eyes. You do not look for faces. There is no purpose to that motion. The work expects no intimacy. You fill and hand up the measured portions through the small opening. Hands below receive them and withdraw. The exchange is mechanical, a transaction in food and silence. You make your way back up to the deck, ledger tucked under your arm like a small and necessary burden. The crew moves in a choreography of function. One man tends the lines, checking knots with fingers worked to a narrow competence. Another polishes the brass fittings, his motions rhythmic as a metronome. The officer inspects with a stillness that reads as authority and habit. No one asks why they perform these tasks. The vessel's need provides the answer. You accept the schedule as one would accept the tide, relentless, indifferent, moving everything within its pull. A bell rings, a short hollow sound, and men pivot to their stations. You step into your assigned place with no show of protest. The watch schedule is a map you have read 100 times, the lines of it worn into muscle memory. You stand near the railing, and the morning wind combs the back of your neck. Your duty is to observe and to report. Sail trim, sea state, any anomaly that might require attention. The notes you gather are factual and unemotional. You record wind direction in degrees, list the sails set, note the humidity like a physician noting temperature. Each data point is small on its own, but collected over time, They form the pattern that keeps the ship from forgetting how to move. The human cargo is below. You know this not from sight, but from the clues that drift upward. The muffled shifting, the occasional cough, the faint scent that rides the air through the grates. The ship's procedure teaches you to treat these signs like any other. Catalogue them, assign them a slot, file them away. Emotion is inefficient here. It complicates tasks, interferes with duty, so you learn to let feelings slip aside and put your focus on the forms, filling spaces where a name would be, drawing a line beside a number, marking a tally that converts lives into a ledger of supply and demand. At a small table near the galley, the headman spreads a map and points to an approximate line on it. The paper crinkles, ink dark against the faint wash of the sea. He commands a tone that betrays nothing. Orders glide from his mouth like statements of weather. Check water casks before midday, he says. Repair the starboard lashings. Keep watch for shoals in the north quadrant. There is no flourish in his manner. He articulates duties as if listing parts of a machine. You answer in the flat tone this language requires, acknowledging with a sound that is more habit than engagement. You're assigned to check the water. The casks are stored low and close to the hull, where the ship keeps its necessities. You test a keg with a dipper, the coolness of the liquid bright against the heat of the morning. You measure, you record, you mark. Enough, less than enough to be conserved. Conserving water becomes a calculus of survival and economy, each mouthful accounted for through the slow precision of rationing. You think of the numbers as you note them, litres, gallons, the small fractions that translate into days. Men move about with quiet competence. One knots and reknots a frayed end, hands sure through practice. Another cleans a rusted block, scraping and oiling until the metal brightens into an obedient shine. The ship rewards this kind of attention. It does not flatter. It demands service and returns only continuity. You have learned to draw a kind of stability from that exchange. It is not comfort, it is predictability. Predictability keeps you awake long enough to perform, to maintain. A cry is stifled somewhere below, a sound that might have been anything from a dropped pot to a plea. It is absorbed by the rhythm of the hull and the other duties that speak louder by virtue of being numerous. No one rushes. There is no clamour for help that cannot be recorded and processed. The ship's logic is not cruel in the melodramatic sense. It is indifferent, a mechanism that separates events into categories and files them according to procedure. You find that this indifference is a skill you learn, a way to continue working while the world keeps unfolding its complexities just out of reach. Mid-morning brings a head count. The steward steps down into the hold with a lantern, ledger in hand. Names are called in a voice made steady by repetition. The sound moves through the planks and back again. A soft echo that leaves impressions rather than disturbances. The roll call is precise, a name, a mark beside it, a note on condition. The process is routine, its rhythm dulling the edge of whatever might be uncomfortable to consider. You watch the marks be made, the ink drying into resolute lines. Life here is often an entry rather than a story. That is its own kind of erosion. When the count is complete, the record is secured and stowed. The numbers are neat, the columns align like rows of obedient soldiers. You close your eyes for the briefest fraction, feeling the ledger's weight in your palms and the deck's slow tilt beneath your feet. It is a grounding weight, a measure of continuity. The ship will remain this way for as long as it must, a procession of duties and recorded facts that swallow time into usefulness. You return to the ropes. There is a particular pleasure, if it can be called that, in the tautness under your palms when a line is trimmed correctly, in the satisfied click when a knot answers the pull as intended. These small certainties stack up against the more chaotic aspects of life. They promise a world that will function if everyone performs their part. You are part of that promise, a quiet hinge in the ship's endless rotation of tasks. As the light shifts and the day moves forward in shades that feel almost anonymous, the ship continues to speak in orders that are ordinary and necessary. You answer them without fanfare. They become the architecture of the morning, shaping your motions, your thoughts, the cadence of your breath. The ledger, the rations, the rope, these are the grammar of your days. You learn to speak it fluently, and in that fluency, you find the particular kind of numbness that allows you to wake each morning and perform the work at hand. The ship does not request your wonder. It requires your compliance. You comply. You climb down the ladder with the log tucked under your arm, each rung a practiced footfall, learned by repetition rather than thought. The light above the hatch shrinks as you descend. By the time you reach the lower deck, the world narrows to the lantern's reluctant glow and the map of shadows it draws along the beams. The air is different here, in a way that reaches past smell and settles into the bones. Denser, warmer, the kind of thickness that makes a shirt cling to skin and slows breath just enough to be noticed. It presses at your face in the first step, a quiet insistence that the ship contains other things besides timber and rope. You move deliberately. The hold is arranged to be functional. Benches bolted low, planks reinforced where weight is constant, small gaps left around the grates to allow the sea to breathe into the vessel's interior. Even the architecture here is an economy of space and purpose. Everything occupies its place and is expected to remain there. You have learned to orient yourself by those fixtures. The lantern hook, the iron ring sunk into the beam, the line of knots that marks the aisle. They are as reliable as the compass and more useful than any comfort. The people below are present as a tenor rather than a collection of faces. Sound is muffled by the layers of wood and fabric, reduced to a hush that moves like a weather system. Occasional rustlings, a cough, a soft scrape as someone shifts position. Light from the grates cuts through in thin bars, catching the edge of a shoulder, the curve of an arm, the slope of a head bowed in sleep or in thought. You do not look for names here. Names are laborious things. They require memory and narrative. The ship prefers records that fit into margins. You note the temperature, the dampness, the odours, as if filling out a form that will be read and filed. The air carries an underlying warm sweetness, not of something pleasant, but of human presence, concentrated and layered. Sweat, breath held too long. The faint fermentation of clothes left close to the skin. There is also the pervasive tang of tar and damp wood, the edge of iron where chains rub, the faint metallic trace of old wounds and recent scabs. These are the elements you record, with the steady hand of someone who understands that precision in observation is the trade that keeps you necessary. The lantern you carry casts a small steady circle. Within it you move along the narrow passageways and mark the positions, counting in a way that converts bodies into a ledger of space. Rows of people sit or lie between the timbers, their limbs folded in the geometry the ship allows. They are arranged with a disciplined efficiency, heads turned toward the planks, knees drawn in, belongings compressed into the smallest possible parcel. Each cluster has been measured and remade to fit the craft's order. Nothing is left to chance beyond the water and the weather. You listen more than you speak. A low murmur drifts from one cluster, the cadence of voices lowered by fatigue and instruction. It carries no narrative for you, only fragments. A number, a name spoken softly and then swallowed, a request, a cough. You register these elements like entries in a log. Disturbance level low, vocal activity minimal, health indicators general. If someone's breathing sharpens or a cry becomes prolonged, there is procedure to follow. You have learned it and can carry it out with numb, steady fingers. A check, a note, the raising of a lantern that moves a man from shadow to view. Hands reach out sometimes, fingers brushing the ledger, when it passes near, but there is little expectation of touch and less of comfort. Interaction below is transactional and brief. The ship's design makes intimacy difficult and, in small ways, discourages it. Where there is need, it is met with the methods the officers have laid down. Temperature checks, a poultice if available, isolation if required by the stern rules of containment. Compassion, when it surfaces, does so in private and vanishes quickly. It is a crack in the ordered plan and must be mended or ignored. You inspect for signs that will matter in the day's entries later. Skin tones shifted toward pallor, eyes rimmed with red, the rate of coughs per hour logged against a column. You dip a cloth into a basin and press it lightly to a fevered brow when the steward has authorized a measure. The action is small, but contains a gravity, because it will be recorded. Treating a symptom here is an act that transforms into an administrative note. The human detail evaporates into a neat entry that can be cross-referenced at need. Sometimes you find objects slipped into the spaces between planks, a small scrap of cloth tied in a knot, a carved bead, the remnant of a keepsake. You pick them up and turn them over in your hands with the absence of curiosity that comes from knowing their fate is not yours to decide. You replace them where you found them or hand them to the steward. They become part of another inventory, another column, things that might be sold, traded or recorded as property. You feel a small constriction in your chest at that thought, an almost memory of empathy that you do not have language for here, and the motion passes as quickly as it arrived. The grating near the keel lets in a thin ribbon of light, and you crouch there to check the ties and the supports. The ropes are dry with salt, fibres split in places where friction has been consistent. You knot and splice where necessary, working efficiently because you know the smallest fray can become a larger failure when the sea grows impatient. Your hands move with the competence of habit. Measure, knot, tighten, test. The practical rhythm steadies something in you, and for a moment the hold's claustrophobic heat becomes a place of ordered work rather than only confinement. A soft sound catches your attention from the far corner. A child's quiet humming, the sort of melody that has been taught and retaught until it becomes a lullaby only the sea remembers. It is not loud and it is not meant for you, yet it travels through the planks like a small, brave current. For an instant you consider stepping closer, offering a portion of fresh water if you still have any, but the ledger at your side reminds you of scarcity in a measured ink. You carry on, the gesture remaining as unfinished as a sentence. The steward moves through the rows with a steadiness that betrays his experience. He carries instruments for weighing, small ceramic bowls for measuring powders, cloths for compresses. His face is set in the methodical expression of someone who balances care with the immutable rules of the ship. He issues commands in the soft manner that seeps into the hold like more lantern light. Tie the left wrist loose, keep blankets dry and folded, mark the cough 3 times and note the hours. The lines are often clinical, the tone is precise. This manner is the way the ship manages the unruly complexity of life below into manageable categories. You help with the distribution of water concentrate, watching as the liquid darkens a wooden cup and is passed along a chain of hands. Men and women take small sips and hand the cup on. The economies of sharing are strict here. The sequence is ritual and efficiency rolled into one. Cup, sip, hand, record. No one lingers in conversation. Sips are hushed acknowledgements that the world continues in a measured fashion. There are moments, uncommon but not unknown, when a face will lift and a pair of eyes will meet yours. In those instances, something like recognition flickers, a bright, transient thing. You will hold the gaze a breath too long and then look away, because prolonged contact invites questions your role does not allow you to answer. The ledger waits, the column needs finishing, and you return to the tasks that define your day. The glances become a grammar of suppressed humanness. A nod, a brief smile remembered like a secret. The curl of fingers tightened around a small token until knuckles blanch. As the lantern's oil diminishes, you make a final sweep, noting where extra blankets are required, where the air seems to stagnate, where the grating needs clearing to let the salt air in. You secure the entries, times, conditions, recommendations. Each line is written with a deliberate hand. Ink dries into permanence, and the ship files it away in a manner consistent with all its other forms of order. You climb back toward the deck when the light above begins to brighten, the air at the hatch offering a cool bite that feels almost sharp after the hold's thick warmth. The soundscape opens again, sea, wind, the small orchestration of deck routines. As you emerge, the world outside seems unchanged, as if the lower darkness had been a brief, private world you visited and then set aside, its records safely tucked into the ship's larger accounting. You carry the hold's silence with you as a weight that both grounds and distances. It is part of the ship's ledger now, a series of facts that will appear beside others in a book somewhere above your station. You will continue to move between the decks, tending the practical needs of the voyage and marking what must be marked. The work is precise, the rhythm unwavering, and it is how you keep the vessel moving forward, one careful observation at a time. You step back onto the open deck, and the air meets you with a coolness that feels almost abstract after the thick heat below. The sky has shifted into a muted wash of blue-grey, a colour that seems neither morning nor afternoon, but something suspended between hours. The ship receives you without acknowledgement, its boards flexing under your feet with the same slow patience they grant to every movement. Nothing here rushes, nothing here lingers. Everything settles into its place with the quiet certainty of numbers repeating themselves. You fall into the rhythm of the deck automatically, guided not by orders spoken aloud, but by the long chain of unbroken tasks the vessel demands. Procedures here unfold like a set of equations, each motion solving a problem too old to question. You begin with the barrels stored aft, their shapes lined in neat sequences that make the deck resemble a kind of abacus. Salted meat, dried grains, preserved fruit in rare quantities. Each one has a designated weight, a designated expectation, a place in the day's calculations. You take hold of the scale with deliberate steadiness, letting the counterweight settle before lifting the first barrel. The rope creaks as it takes on the load, and the numbers form themselves in your mind before they even reach the logbook. You know the feel of a barrel that has lost too much weight to spillage or evaporation. You know the subtle difference between wood swollen by humidity and wood carrying too much cargo. These distinctions have become the vocabulary of your hands. You record the figures with a slow precision. The ledger absorbs them without argument, its pages already crowded with the quiet mathematics of routine. You turn to the next barrel and then the next, following a sequence that extends across the deck like stepping stones, leading nowhere in particular. The crew moves around you in similar patterns, each man engaging in his own muted arithmetic, checking the angle of a sail, tightening a line by measured degrees, adjusting the helm to correct the ship's long wandering drift. The ocean creates its own cadence beneath all of this, lifting and lowering the deck with a motion so regular that your body has learned to sway in time with it. It is a rhythm without drama, a rolling breathing movement that suggests nothing beyond continuity. When you look out across the water, the horizon lies in a soft, unbroken line. The waves rise in low undulations, their edges rounded by distance and repetition. Even the white caps seem half-hearted, dissolving against the hull with little more than a sigh. You turn toward the water casks next, each bound with iron hoops that glint in the dull light. You open them one at a time, dipping the long-handled gauge into the depths and listening for the familiar echo that tells you how far the level has fallen. Water is the ship's quiet currency, consumed, lost to evaporation, reduced by necessity. Each measure is a figure that must be balanced against the day's rationing. The number of bodies aboard, the length of the voyage still pressing itself into the future. The gauge comes up dripping. You read the mark, transfer it to the ledger, and feel the faint tightening in your chest that accompanies any downward trend. There is nothing dramatic in the shortage, merely another variable to accommodate, another shift in the arithmetic that the officers will process into decisions. You close the cask gently, not out of sentiment, but because the wood has grown brittle in places and must be handled with care if it is to last the voyage. A gull circles overhead, calling once before gliding into the distance. The cry feels almost foreign here, a brief sound that carries no meaning for the routines of the ship. You watch it vanish and return to your work. Meaning comes not from what interrupts the arithmetic, but from what sustains it. Nearby, 2 men lift a crate filled with spare rigging. They test the weight of it together, adjusting their grips until the load is balanced evenly between them. When they move, their steps are synchronized by necessity rather than camaraderie. The crate finds its place next to the repair bench, where frayed line and damaged blocks are set aside in rows like objects under examination. You take note of the placement, mark the inventory changes, and continue forward. The officer approaches with the measured pace of someone who understands that urgency is rarely rewarded at sea. He glances at your ledger, his eyes drifting down the columns, as if confirming a set of predictions. His nod is small, perhaps unreadable to anyone unfamiliar with his manner, but you understand the gesture for what it is, acknowledgement that the ship's arithmetic remains coherent, at least for now. He moves on without speaking. Words here are used sparingly, reserved for deviations from expectation rather than confirmations of it. You walk toward the bow, where the wind brushes your face with a mild, damp chill. The sea stretches out in every direction, a vast sheet of muted colour, broken only by the slow pulse of waves. You watch the surface shift in wide, unhurried patterns, and for a moment it becomes clear why the officers speak of navigation as though it were a conversation between vessel and water. The ocean answers in degrees, in lengths, in drift. It accepts the ship's calculations, never arguing, never offering affirmation. It simply continues. Another task calls, confirming the weight of the remaining ballast stones. You crouch near the hold's upper edge, lowering the weight line until it touches the stones beneath. The reading comes back constant. Stability remains within its expected threshold. You copy the figure into the ledger and close the book briefly, letting your fingers rest against the worn cover. Your hands have memorized this texture, the rough grain of leather softened over time, the corners frayed, the faint imprint where the quill has pressed through, page after page. The weight of the book is small, but it contains the logic of the voyage, the counts, the measures, the slow erosion of supplies. When you hold it, you feel momentarily anchored in the shifting world of sea and sky. A gust of wind fills the sails, the canvas billowing with a deep, resonant sound. The masts vibrate in response, sending a tremor through the deck that is not unsettling, but familiar, like the exhale of a creature adjusting its posture. You look upward and watch the ropes strain slightly, their knots tightening under the new tension. One of the deckhands calls out a measurement, and another answers with the numbers needed to correct the course. You walk back toward the middeck, passing coils of rope arranged with careful order. The ship's surfaces are worn smooth, where countless hands have gripped them, where boots have stepped in identical paths over and over. You think for a moment of the uncounted sets of figures that came before yours. Other ledgers, other hands dipping gauges, other eyes scanning horizons indistinguishable from today's. The arithmetic repeats, only the names change. You inspect the pulleys next, running your fingers along the grooves where the ropes sit. You feel for cracks, test the spin of each wheel, note the ones that drag or hesitate. Each small imperfection represents a fraction in the larger equation of the ship's endurance. You mark them for replacement and move on. The sun climbs a little higher, but remains subdued, filtered by a thin veil of cloud that softens the light until it feels more like a reflection than a source. The ocean responds with muted gleams, patches of brightness that appear and fade without rhythm. You watch these flickers while adjusting the angle of a loose spar, letting the repetition of motion calm the last bits of tension from your shoulders. There is no drama in the work, only the slow accumulation of tasks completed, numbers noted, weights confirmed. You find a strange steadiness in it, a sense that the world is not asking for anything beyond what your hands already know. A distant splash draws your attention to the port side. A school of small fish breaks the surface briefly before diving back into the depths. The disturbance leaves behind a series of ripples that spread outward in measured rings, dissolving into the sea's wider rhythm. You watch until they disappear entirely, absorbed by the larger pattern. The day's final calculations bring you back to the aft rail, where you confirm the ship's drift by comparing the current's pull against the weight line dropped behind the stern. The difference is slight, within acceptable limits. You record the figure, close the ledger again, and rest both hands on the railing. Below, the water slides past with a quiet persistence, carrying the ship forward as though escorting it through an endless corridor. The waves rise and fall in patient intervals, each one a small part of the ocean's ongoing arithmetic. You exhale slowly, matching your breath to that rhythm, not consciously, but because your body has begun to understand the pattern of its own accord. Everything here is a calculation. Everything finds its place, and the sea accepts each figure without expectation, without refusal, without haste. You stand there a moment longer, letting the numbers settle in your mind like silt, drifting to the bottom of a calm basin, before turning toward the next task, waiting quietly for your hands. You remain for a moment near the stern, letting the rail cool your palms. But the ship does not leave spaces empty for long. Its routines pull you onward with the same quiet gravity as the tide. The next duty waits in the dim corridor leading to the supply deck, where the barrels sit in their neat, obedient rows, and the day's allotments must be divided with careful, unhurried hands. You make your way toward them, the narrow passage amplifying the small sounds of your steps, the soft thud of boots against wood, the subtle shift of the ship beneath you, the repetitive hum of water pressing along the hull. When you reach the storeroom, the smell meets you first, a mixture of dried grain, salted meat, and the faint dusty note of flour that clings to the air like a thin layer of chalk. It is a scent that signals necessity rather than comfort. Rationing begins with unsealing the day's supply, a moment that carries no ceremony. You lift the lid from a barrel of hardtack and hear the dull scrape of wood against metal. Inside, the biscuits lie stacked with geometric precision, their shapes rigid and impersonal, each one nearly indistinguishable from the next. You take a small handful, letting the crumbs fall back into the barrel, and begin counting. The number aligns with the ledger's expectation, so you move on to the next container. Salted meat requires more deliberation. You ease out a slab, noting the dryness of the edges, the stiffness that indicates how long it has been stored. You cut it into portions using a practiced rhythm, the knife guiding itself with the muscle memory of countless similar mornings. Each strip is weighed by feel before being set aside, though you later confirm the weight on the scale that hangs from the beam. Your estimates rarely waver now. Precision has become an instinct. A small scoop of peas completes the rations for the crew. They clatter into the tin bowl with a softness that belies their hardness. You record their measure with a short stroke in the ledger. One mark, then another. These are the smallest decisions of the ship, yet they accumulate into something that feels like the skeleton of the voyage, a framework of quantities and distributions that gives shape to the days. When distributing the crew's allotments, you move without thought. Each man receives his portion with the same absence of ceremony that marks every exchange aboard. A nod here, a muttered acknowledgement there, and the routine carries itself forward like a mechanism that runs by weight rather than intention. But the greater labour waits below. A lantern is lit for the journey downward, though its light barely cuts through the thick air. The hold greets you with the same compressed heat as before, but now the scent is punctuated by the sharp tang of dried food and the faint sourness that rises when bodies have been still too long. Chains shift as people prepare themselves instinctively for what the morning brings. Even without command, the body knows when to expect sustenance. You begin with the bowls, wooden worn, each with its own pattern of scratches, left by countless meals that came before. You fill them in a slow cadence, a piece of biscuit softened by water, a strip of meat, a handful of peas. The portions feel small because they are, and their sameness dulls any notion of generosity. You place the bowls within reach, and hands emerge from the dimness to take them. Some move quickly, others hesitate, as if unsure whether the bowl belongs to them or someone else. Hunger makes questions delicate. You keep your gaze steady, neither inviting nor avoiding eye contact. The ship requires a certain stillness of demeanour here. Not coldness, exactly, but a distance that flattens emotion into procedure. You do not speak unless necessary. The sound of your voice would feel intrusive in this compressed world of breath and heat. You work through the rows, one bowl after another, and the entire process resembles an accounting exercise more than a meal. Each portion is a number that must align with another number. Each distribution is a line in an ongoing calculation that stretches beyond your comprehension. The ship reduces need into formulas, hunger into allocations, lives into units per day. Some below eat quietly, others eat slowly, as if stretching the moment across the vague blur of the hours ahead. You step carefully among them, ensuring the lantern does not swing too abruptly and startle someone. The glow reveals small details, the curve of a shoulder, the tension of fingers wrapped around a bowl, the sheen of perspiration catching the light like thin varnish. Once all bowls are handed out, you begin to gather the empty ones from the previous meal. A few come back clean, scraped down to their grain. Others bear remnants that cling to the wood like dried paste. You stack them, the scrape of bowl against bowl, echoing faintly in the hold. The sound collects itself into a rhythm, soft, quick, hollow, and merges with the dull murmur of breathing around you. You take note of the bodies you pass. Someone slumps more heavily than yesterday, their head drooping at an angle that registers as concerning. Another holds their bowl with trembling fingers. A third stares straight ahead, blinking slowly, as if time were a weight pressing down on their skull. You observe each detail with the same methodical attention you give to the barrels or casks. You do not categorize them as suffering. You categorize them as data. A man coughs, the sound sharp but brief. You pause long enough to mark the frequency on a small scrap of paper, then tuck it into the ledger. The notation is simple, 3 strokes and a time. It feels almost invisible, but the ship insists on such records, not out of sympathy, but out of caution. Illness here is a variable that must be watched. Above, the ship creaks. A rope snaps taut, followed by the hollow thump of a foot on deck. These sounds filter into the hold in softened fragments, giving you the sense of the world moving even as this place remains condensed and still. You gather the last bowl and step back toward the ladder. Before leaving, you extinguish the lantern and breathe out in a slow, deliberate motion. The air shifts around you, adjusting to the absence of light. You close the hatch with the gentleness the wood demands, allowing it to settle into its frame without protest. Back on deck, the world expands again. the cool air rising around you like a release. You wipe your sleeve across your forehead, though the sweat collects again, almost immediately. The ledger waits open on the small table near the mast, its columns ready for the next entries. You record the rations distributed, the condition of the hold, the minor observations your eye has captured. There is no satisfaction in finishing the task, only the quiet acknowledgement that another measure has been fulfilled, another figure added to the ship's machinery of routine. You turn the page and leave it open for the officer who will review it later. Around you, the crew continues their own responsibilities. Someone ties a knot with deliberate slowness, ensuring each coil lies flat. Someone else stirs a pot at the galley door, adding a pinch of salt with the detached concentration of a man who has done so too often to taste anything anymore. The machinery of the ship turns through these small unembellished motions, each one contributing to a system that operates without sentiment. You take a moment to stand still again, feeling the sea lifting the deck with its unhurried pulse. The routine settles into your thoughts as naturally as breath. The measuring, the distributing, the recording, a world made of quantities, a world where necessity becomes a kind of language. The ledger rests beneath your hand, warm from the sun. You close it softly, the cover creasing under your fingers, and prepare for whatever task the next quiet command will bring. You step away from the ledger and let the pen fall back into its place. The book's weight has a small authority. Closing it is a statement that today's measures are accounted for. The deck vibrates underfoot with the ship's slow insistence, and your attention slides from the neat rows of barrels to the people who keep those rows orderly. They move without spectacle, as if their bodies were cogs fitted to the hull's turning, precise, uncomplaining, and almost ornamental in their reliability. You watch a man at the halyards feed a line through his hands. His fingers are raw where the rope has rubbed, the skin a mapped geography of callus and small white scars. He works with a patient economy, pulling just the right length, looping the coil into a careful figure. He does not speak. Speech would interrupt the balance of things. A brief grunt answers a question posed from a distance, and that is the conversation the ship allows. Necessary, curt, immediately return to silence. The lack of chatter shapes the morning as much as the sails do. A boy, not much older than a memory of home, tightens a sail's lacing beside him, eyes narrowed as if measuring angles by the light hitting the canvas. He hums a tune so low you almost miss it, a thread of sound swallowed by the wind. It is not a song meant to be shared. It's a small private rhythm that keeps his hands moving and his thoughts tethered. You recognize the method. Each man has a quiet pulse that keeps him from watching the greater silence expand. Near the capstan, 4 men heave in the practice sequence that keeps the pumps and windlass turning. Their movements are synchronous, a slow, disciplined arc of muscle and breath. The leader calls out numbers in a flat cadence, 1, 2, 3, each count serving as the soft metronome that prevents fatigue from collapsing the work. You feel the measured weight of that counting in your chest, like a tide obeying an unseen lunar rule. There is no boasting in their effort, no complaint beyond what the rhythm permits. The task requires compliance. They give it. Occasionally, a laugh tries to surface. Small, brittle, quickly stifled. It dies not from hostility, but from habit. Levity is a surplus the ship cannot afford. Expressions are economy as well. A smile uses resources in social energy best conserved for tasks requiring actual exertion. You find that you have learned to read faces as if they were instruments. A tightened jaw signals endurance, a slack brow hints at exhaustion, a brief lift at the eyebrow denotes a carefully hidden question. Communication here is minimal because it must be efficient. The officer's presence is an almost architectural fact, part of the ship's scaffolding. He moves along the rail, inspecting, pausing only long enough to appraise, and then to release the men back to their motions. His evaluations are not performances, they are checks in an ongoing maintenance plan. You see the way his eyes mark the alignment of a sail, the angle of a spar, the cleanliness of a block. He gives no speeches. His corrections are gestures. A repositioned coil, a finger along a fraying splice, a curt instruction that contains within it a history of repeated variants. Meals appear as units of time, and the intervals between them are filled with the discipline of labour. Men polish brass fittings with exacting strokes, oiling hinges that squeak only when neglected. Others mend sails in long solitary patches of work, the needle passing in and out with a sound like rain on tin. These motions are small liturgies, reverent in their repetition, sacred because they preserve the vessel's order. The reverence is not for beauty, but for survivability. You move among them, and your presence is accepted without fanfare. A hand brushes past you as two sailors cross on an aisle, shoulders barely acknowledging each other's weight. Such proximity breeds a peculiar intimacy that is not sentimental, it is functional. Bodies learn to move close without touching, to share space without conversation. The air between people is thick with unspoken accommodations. A step taken to give another room, a muscle eased to take the strain, a look kept brief to avoid distraction. Sometimes the compliance is procedural to the point of brutality. When a line tangles or a crate slips its lashings, the response is swift and efficient rather than frantic. A knot is retied, a lash is secured, a man steps into the gap with hands that know where to press. The solution is not accompanied by outrage or relief, only the continuation of labour. The ship's logic transforms crisis into a sequence of correctives, and men learn to think in checklists rather than in narratives. There are rituals among the crew as well, quiet ones that stitch people to one another without words. At dawn, a cup of watered ale is passed with careful hands and exchanged by nods rather than commentary. In the shade of the mizzen, someone hums an old line of prayer before tying his scarf against the sun. In rare intervals, a man will read a scrap of verse by lamplight, half for the memory of the words, half for the cadence that steadies the tongue. These small acts are guarded and brief. They do not alter the prevailing atmosphere, but they soften its edges just enough to keep a person from cracking. You notice gestures that speak of restrained humanity. A cloth folded and laid over a boot left in the rain. A share of extra biscuit slipped into a pocket with the same deliberate motion used for storing tools. Such actions are not announced. They are the private economies that exist within the public ledger of duty. They are the tiny exemptions that allow a man to retain some portion of self without disrupting the ship's ledger. When an illness appears, the crew's compliance takes on a clinical hue. The sick are moved according to established practice, isolated where possible, tended by the steward with remedies measured precisely, and dispensed with the surgeon's care only when necessary. The crew watches with that same economy, concerned enough to follow the protocol, but distant enough to avoid emotional disarray. The ship's survival depends on this balance. Too much feeling and work falters, too little, and neglect becomes a hazard. Discipline extends into speech. Conversations begin and end with a technicality. The exchange of a fact, the passing of a measurement, a report of condition. Men speak of weather, sails, repair. When they speak of places they once knew, their voices become detached maps. Dates, locations, the brief warmth of a remembered harbour. Narratives are abridged into facts. Facts are filed and cited without flourish. The sleep of story is suspended here, replaced by the sleep of records. Yet there is a current of tenderness that slips beneath the compliance, subtle, transient, often disguised as efficiency. A hand steadies another while reefing a sail. A spare blanket is tucked closer to a sleeping man, as if in spite of instruction. Someone hums a lullaby through a broken sleep to calm an uneasy child. These moments are not declarations. They are maintenance of a different sort. tending to the fragile human needs that paperwork cannot accommodate. They appear like thin, cautious light through cracks, and then they are folded back into the larger shade. The sun slides along the sky, casting the deck in bands of heat and shadow. The crew's motions adapt to the changing light. Heavier work shifts to morning or late afternoon. The noon is for careful handling of stores and the slow mending of sails. Each movement is calibrated to conserve energy and to maintain the machine of the ship. You follow these adjustments as a matter of course, matching your pace to the tempo of those around you. You find yourself reflecting, not in the language of introspection, but in practical inventory. The number of pairs of hands available for heavy work, the condition of boots, the elasticity of a rope after mending. Your mind records these as if they were entries in a ledger, each observation translating into a metric that can be checked against future needs. Practicality becomes a form of care. Night approaches with a softened inevitability. Lanterns are trimmed and stowed with familiar motions. Watches are assigned with brisk nods and clipped phrases. The crew settles into the pattern required for darkness. Some below in the cramped heat, others on deck in rotation, all part of the ship's continuing mechanism. Compliance remains, but it changes texture. From the upright efficiency of day to the watchful stillness of night. Before your own watch begins, a man who has worked beside you all day pauses and offers you a small scrap of dried citrus. An odd, bright thing of little practical use, yet valuable in its rarity. You take it without comment, feeling the odd warmth of being considered in a place designed to minimize consideration. The gesture holds no speech, yet it carries more meaning than most exchanges on board. There is a quiet after that, a brief slackening in the ship's hum. It is not rest so much as a maintenance of momentum in a reduced register. You take your position at the rail, inhaling the changing air, feeling the familiar tilt under your boots. The crew continues its quiet compliance, every man and boy folded into the ordered pattern as the evening draws close. Their motions have kept the vessel intact. Their restraint has made endurance possible. You breathe and let the rhythm of the ship guide you into the night's slow, watchful hours, knowing that the same measured obedience will greet the next dawn and the next, in an unbroken procession of quiet work. You take your place at the rail as the last of the daylight loosens its hold, the deck cools underneath your boots, and the air becomes thinner, clearer, as if the world itself were pausing to breathe. The ship slides forward in the faint wake of day's labour, and you find the steady sway familiar enough to be a companion rather than a nuisance. Night gathers in a soft, deliberate way, not sudden but cumulative, like the folding of a page. Above stars puncture the dark, but do not glare. They hang like notes on a muted score, measured and distant. Your lantern is banked low at your side, trimmed so that its light does not betray the ship to curious eyes or draw unnecessary attention. You rely on the small circle it casts, enough to ink notes, to inspect the rigging within reach, to watch for anything that might interrupt the night's economy. The rest of the world is rendered in ranges of grey, the nearer rolls of sea, the darker swell beyond them, the silhouette of masts, standing like patient columns. Sound is accentuated at night, every creak and sigh clearer against the hush. The hull answers the touch of waves with a patient thump, a sound you have learned to translate into degrees of leisure or concern. You set the logbook on the rail and dip your pen. Your hand moves with a measured slowness. Recording time, wind direction, sail set, the faint drift of the vessel by degree. Each entry is economical, precise, a list of facts that will be consulted and compared at other hours. The ink spreads slightly on the page in the cool air, then dries into its appointed place. Writing feels ceremonial in this hour. The scratch of quill, an old machinery that produces order from motion. The sky offers its own data. You glance up, letting the constellations provide small assurances about latitude and bearing. The patterns are not companions, but tools, steady markers against a sea that might otherwise seem endless and arbitrary. You translate the night into coordinates, in the same way you translate grain into portions, a conversion of raw presence into something intelligible and usable. From the hold comes the faint, regulated chorus you have grown accustomed to, a cough here, a soft shift of weight there, the occasional murmur exchanged in the low register that travels poorly through wood. You make a note of the noise levels and the location where they originate. Such details, when aggregated, reveal trends that may one day demand attention. Tonight, they are within acceptable bounds. You mark them so and move on. The act is much about containment as about compassion. Measures contain what feeling cannot. Your gaze travels outward, watching the line where water meets sky. The sea's surface is a study in quiet geometry. Long ripples arranged by currents, small perturbations, where wind meets water, the occasional dark patch that suggests a change of condition. You test the air with gloved fingers, feeling for subtle shifts in temperature and moisture. These small tests you file away mentally. A faint drop in temperature, a higher salinity smell near the stern, each a hint of weather to come, or a whisper of the sea's mood. A gull, solitary and ghost-like in the starlight, circles once and vanishes. Its presence provokes no fancy in you. It is merely another moving point to be acknowledged. Birds, like other anomalies, are logged without flourish. The night is not a place for speculation. It is a place for watching, for noticing and noting, and then returning to the leisured calm. You listen for the creak that signals stress on spars and halyards. When a line sings under strain, you follow its sound with eyes and hands. Reading tension, like an experienced reader, scans text for meaning. You test a nearby rope with a practiced tug, fingers sensitive to the snap that presages fraying. If a weakness is detected, you do not alarm, you record and plan. The machinery of repair is a slow certainty that will be set in motion in the morning, or sooner if need be. Beneath your feet, the deck breathes with the living cargo's faint presence. You do not watch them as some might. You do not seek faces. The grates allow the ship to draw a little of their world up to you. A hushed cough, the thump of a shuttered foot, and you note these elements with the same calm you bring to weather and water. Observations are the currency of your watch, exact, unemotional, and functional. Around you, the crew moves in softened shapes. A man trims a sail with quiet, economical motions. Two others shift a coil of rope without exchanging more than the necessary words. The economy of speech at night is practical, an instruction where required, a confirmation in a thin tone, acknowledgements clipped to conserve breath. Conversation expands only into the smallest pockets. A short remark about the weather, a terse comment on the state of a block, a brief exchange about an earlier repair. These are not talk for the sake of talk. They are the language of maintenance. At times your thoughts wander, not to memories, but to lists that shape how you will act come morning. The inventory of oil, the condition of spare blocks, the number of blankets beneath the grates. Your mind organizes things into columns like your ledger. The habit is not ornamental, it keeps you awake and useful. Sleep is a commodity allotting itself in brief increments. Wakefulness is a tool you must manage as carefully as the casks. The horizon is not empty. Far off, in the dim distance, a shadow suggests the crest of another hull. You pick it out and watch the shape for long moments, noting its angle and speed. There is a human economy even in the presence of other ships, a calculation of potential contact, of distance and intent. You mark its bearing and set the detail down in the book. The possible becomes a data point, and data points guide choices. A faint bell from the binnacle counts the passing of an hour. Small, punctual, a sound that structures the watch more effectively than conversation. You write the time beside the latest measurements, and then close the book for a moment, resting your palm upon the leather. The cool of the night presses through the glove and straightens your fingers. Presentness is a matter of small steadies. Notes, checks, a hand on the rail to measure the ship's tilt and its subtle irregularities. Sometimes the sea offers an interruption that is not a problem, but a reminder of its otherness. Phosphorescence trailing the stern in a slow ghostly glow as small creatures are disturbed, a whale's distant blow which puffs into the air and disappears like a tiny concern. These occurrences do not invite wonder so much as entry into a longer register of observation. They are added to the ledger of the night, brief entries of the kind that will be read along with many others to form the fuller shape of the voyage. You check the watch lines, feeling the tautness and the small give that indicates wind strength. Measurements are translated into small corrections. A fraction of a yard eased here, a slight adjustment in the sheet's angle there. You order the changes with crisp brevity and watch one of the men implement them with the cautious precision of someone who knows the balance of the ship by the sound of its ropes. Below, a cough lengthens briefly. You make a sharper note and rub the quill between your fingers. This is the kind of notation that grows in importance over time, if patterns form. You recall the names associated with the nearest bench only as ledger references. Not a denial of human reality, but an adherence to the method that allows you to respond without being overwhelmed. Your watch is not dramatic. It does not demand heroics. It demands attention. A steady hand, a careful eye, the translation of sensation into record. You keep this pattern until the eastern edge of the sky lightens imperceptibly, a thin band of grey that suggests the world is moving toward another hour. The change is slow enough that it might be missed by someone not paying attention, but you notice it because noticing is the work of your night. When your relief arrives, you pass on the log and the lines with the same concise manner you expect in return. There is an economy of trust in the exchange. Measured, efficient, necessary. You descend to rest in the brief hours allotted to you. The world temporarily dimmed to a small private sphere. Sleep comes not as oblivion, but as a shallow, controlled surrender. The ledger closed at your side, the sea continuing its slow arithmetic beneath you. You wake again to the subdued stir of bodies and timber, not startled, not rested, simply brought back to motion by the same cycle that governs everyone aboard. The air has the faint coolness of early light, though no dawn yet breaks across the sky. You rise because the next task waits, and tasks, more than sleep, divide the hours into something workable. Your muscles remember the pattern before your thoughts do, guiding you toward the deck with the quiet obedience of long practice. Once outside, the day slips into its familiar shape. The sea is a muted slate, soft-edged under a veil of cloud, and the ship wears its weariness plainly. The masts stand firm, but even they show their age in the faint sag of the rigging, the dark streaks where tar has run in thin rivulets. You take in the condition the way others might take in weather, a quick assessing glance that tells you what needs attention and what can be left to endure a little longer. You are drawn first to the place where the ropes hang, coiled in orderly rows. Each bundle has its own history, marked by knots tied during storms, frays earned through weeks of strain, stiff patches where salt dried into the fibres. You run your fingers along a line and feel a softness where there should be resistance. The rope has begun to give way, slowly, predictably. There is no urgency in the discovery. Wear is not a threat here. It is a certainty. You lift the coil and bring it to the repair bench, where tools lie arranged in neat, utilitarian lines. A marlin spike, a fid, needles thick enough to stitch canvas, spools of twine that wait like quiet, patient substitutes for muscle. You settle into the work without thought, hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who has repaired more ropes than he has tied. The rhythm steadies your breath. Unravel, trim, splice, bind. Each motion is small, exact part of a method you repeat often enough that your mind drifts even as your fingers remain sure. Nearby, a beam groans underfoot, the complaint of old wood shifting under changing pressure. You mark the sound internally, recognizing it as one to revisit. The ship speaks in these murmurs, not in warnings, but in reminders. A loosened peg here, a strained joint there. You know how to listen without alarm, reading the tones as part of the vessel's daily conversation with the sea. The repaired rope coils neatly when finished, its new splice clean and taut. You hang it again among the others and move toward the midship beam, whose voice reached you earlier. The wood is darkened from years of exposure, the grain ridged where countless footsteps have passed. When you press your palm to it, you feel a faint give. Nothing dangerous, but enough to warrant reinforcement. You retrieve wedges and a mallet, position them beneath the beam, and tap them into place with gentle, even strokes. The wood accepts the adjustment quietly, as though accustomed to these small interventions. All around you, similar acts unfold. A man at the bow replaces a pulley wheel, testing its spin with the same concentration he might give a compass bearing. Another scrapes a rusted hinge with methodical strokes, pausing only to apply a layer of oil that gleams faintly in the dim light. None of these duties require conversation. They are shared understandings, upheld not by instruction, but by necessity. You watch them with the same awareness you bring to your own tasks. A recognition that each small repair belongs to a larger system no single hand controls. A torn piece of canvas flaps weakly near the mizzen, its edge frayed by weeks of wind. You take it down and spread it across the deck. The fabric, stiff and weary, holds the memory of storms and spray. You thread a needle with strong twine and begin to stitch, pulling the seam tight in careful, measured increments. The ship rocks beneath you in its slow, predictable sway, and the canvas shifts in response. You adjust without pausing. These motions, familiar as breathing, ask no effort from the mind. They simply continue. When the patch is complete, you run your thumb along the seam. It lies flat, secure, prepared to withstand whatever strain the next days impose. You hoist the canvas back into place, tying the lines with a sequence of knots you could perform blindfolded. The repaired section catches the wind and pulls. The strain feels even, balanced. You note it instinctively and move on. Tools clink softly, wood sighs. The ship settles into the day's work with the resignation of something long past protest. You understand that expression. It is the way of things aboard. A life made from maintenance, governed by routines that predate your presence, and will continue long after your part in the mends. You pause near the grating that leads to the lower decks. A faint current of warm air rises through the slats, carrying the dense mix of heat, sweat, and confinement that marks the human weight below. You do not linger. Repairs allocate themselves according to priority. And the next task calls from the starboard gunwale, where a section of railing has loosened. The nails have worked themselves out through repeated exposure to wet and wind. You kneel, remove the damaged fastenings, and replace them with new ones, driving each in with deliberate pressure until the wood holds firm. Every repair has a repetitive quality, but repetition is not monotony here. It is structure. It is the means by which the ship continues to exist. You think of this as you inspect the rigging once more, tugging ropes, tapping beams, checking the alignment of spars. Each small action folds into the next, and the day organizes itself along the line of your attention. Men nearby carry out their duties with equal steadiness. Someone sharpens a blade, the scrape of metal against stone, creating a dry, repetitive rhythm. Another cleanses a lantern's glass, wiping away soot until the dim sun finds a clear path through it. A third patches a section of deck where water has seeped in, driving a new plank into place with the sound of muted thuds. These activities flow around you like a quiet current, steady and impersonal. A faint shudder runs through the hull as the ship meets a larger wave. You brace without fear, recognizing the movement as part of the sea's ordinary behavior. Still, you check the nearest ropes for tension, ensuring none have tightened to the point of strain. The lines give a little under your pull, just enough to show they remain obedient to their purpose. Farther along the deck, a bucket has cracked, likely from sun and salt. You retrieve it, examine the split, and repair it with a thin strip of metal bound by rivets. The work is quick, almost automatic. The bucket returns to its place without ceremony, and the deck feels no different for its restoration. Yet the act matters. The ship's machinery is built from such increments. By midday, the light brightens and the wind picks up. Sails strain gently, ropes hum with a low vibration, and the scent of the ocean sharpens. You take a moment to scan the horizon, though scanning is more habit than vigilance. Nothing appears out of place. The world extends in every direction, as if pulled taut around the ship. You return to the interior passageway to check the beams there as well. Dampness has crept into the joints, leaving streaks of darkened grain. You scrape away the softened wood, pack the gap with pitch, and smooth it with a slow, deliberate motion. The process is almost meditative. You can sense the ship settling more comfortably as the repairs accumulate, tension easing from its structure in a way that mirrors the easing of your own breath. Every so often, a man working beside you will offer a brief nod, an acknowledgement not of success or struggle, but simply of presence. These exchanges are the closest thing to conversation that repairs permit. They carry a muted gratitude, a recognition that the task is shared, not by choice but by the framework of necessity holding all of you in place. You step back onto the open deck, letting the wind brush past and survey the work completed. The ropes hang neatly again. The canvas lies smooth. The beams stand reinforced. The ship, not renewed but sustained, continues forward with the same muted resolve that marks every hour of its existence. You lift a coil of rope and hang it on its peg, feeling the slight weight settle into place. Another task finished. Another part of the vessel held together for another stretch of water and time. The day moves on quietly, its shape defined by the work your hands have performed, without question, without hurry, without anticipation of thanks. And as the hull groans lightly in the shifting swell, you sense the machinery of routine continuing around you, an old script unfolding itself, one line at a time, carried forward by the steady rhythm of compliance, purpose, and repair. You set the repaired tools back in their places, each one returning to its appointed slot, with the quiet certainty of something that will soon be needed again. The deck shifts beneath your feet in a long, even roll, carrying the ship through another stretch of indifferent ocean. You feel the familiar pull of the next task before anyone names it. Routines tend to announce themselves this way, subtle, internal cues guiding you from one duty to another. The logbook waits on the small table near the main mast, its leather cover softened by years of handling, corners worn to a dull rounding. The book is rarely closed for long, its pages breathe with the ship, filling steadily with the day's particulars. You ease onto the bench beside it, and the faint creak of wood under your weight folds neatly into the larger symphony of groans and murmurs that accompany every inch of the vessel. You open to the next blank page, and the faint scent of ink greets you, sharp, familiar, almost medicinal. The quill lies beside the inkwell, its point stained from dozens of earlier entries. You dip it slowly, waiting for the bead of black to settle at its tip before lifting it to the paper. The act feels ritualistic, not from sentiment but from necessity. The ship demands a record of itself, and your hand is simply the instrument by which it speaks. You begin with the weather. Clouds, low and unbroken. Wind, steady from the west, moderate, reliable. Temperature, cool enough to preserve rations. warm enough that repairs can be done without stiffening hands. You note the sea's condition, the long swell that has followed the ship since dawn, the lack of crosswind, the absence of any threatening current. These details fill the first lines with the gentle order of measurement. No emotion enters the script. It has no place there. Only the facts matter. Next, you move to supplies. You list the water level, the rations distributed, the repairs that required materials from storage. Each figure aligns with the one before it, forming a chain of arithmetic that reinforces the structure of the voyage. You notice that some quantities have dipped lower than anticipated, but you do not record your concern, only the numbers. Concern is not part of the formal script. The officers will interpret the figures. Your duty is to present them without embellishment. A gust of wind brushes the page, lifting its edge for a moment before letting it fall. The quill scratches on, each stroke producing a line of the ongoing account. You pause briefly to wipe a blot of ink from the margin. Small imperfections, though they do not impact the accuracy of the record, are distractions from clarity. The logbook's purpose is purity of information. Even small marks feel like intrusions. As you write, the noises around you settle into patterns you no longer question. A rope thumps lightly against a spar. Boots cross the deck in unhurried, rhythmic steps. A bucket is set down with a muted clunk. These sounds create a faint perimeter around your focus, their constancy reinforcing the calm that the act of recording demands. Nothing interrupts. Nothing insists on attention beyond the next measurement. Your entries shift now to the hold. You describe conditions without description, phrased in the sparse clinical language expected in the ledger. Number of individuals stable. Airflow adequate. Noise level within expected range. Any personal impressions you might have felt in the dim heat of the lower deck are excluded entirely. The book tolerates only facts. It would reject the human weight behind them, if it could. You note a slight increase in coughing from one corner of the hold, reduced movement from another. These are data points, not stories. Each mark stands in for a person whose face you might recall only briefly, if at all. Their existence becomes an entry, their suffering a small shift in the day's arithmetic. You place a dot beside the line, signifying that the steward should verify the report. The dot is round, perfectly circular, almost decorative in its efficiency. It contains more silence than information. The wind changes slightly, and you pause to observe the flag at the stern. Its movement gives you the angle you need for the next entry. You write it down with the same measured pace as everything else. Even the weather is translated into a ledger that refuses sentiment. There is no cold wind brushing your face in this book, only directional degrees and predicted shifts. You turn the page backward briefly, scanning the rows of numbers from previous days. They form a continuous block of ink, marching forward in tidy columns. Each entry resembles the ones before it, a monotony that reflects the voyage itself, steady, relentless, unadorned. If someone were to read only the logbook, they might imagine the ship as a machine with no suffering aboard, no heat or cries from the hold, no crew worn thin by routine. The book sanitizes reality. It was designed to. Still, your hand hesitates over one section. You recall a man below whose breathing had grown faint, whose posture had slumped at an angle that suggested more than exhaustion. The logbook does not accept impressions, and so you do not describe the way his eyes opened slowly, as if unsure of what they were expected to see. Instead, you note reduced mobility, mark a small arrow beside it, and move on. The arrow points forward, though it means nothing beyond classification. A shadow passes over the page as a cloud thickens overhead. The words darken in the shifting light, but you continue writing. Nothing, neither wind nor shadow, interrupts the march of data. You finish the page with figures relating to the crew, number on active duty, number resting, number excused for minor ailments. Your handwriting grows more controlled as the page fills, each character neat and unemotional. You allow no flourish, no tilt of the hand that might suggest feeling. A crewmate approaches briefly, handing you a small slip of paper with a tally of tools borrowed for repair. You record it with a short nod, transcribing the numbers into the appropriate column. The slip is then tucked between the pages to be reviewed later and filed according to protocol. You watch him leave, his steps quiet, quick, devoured by the ship's unending routine. The last section of the page awaits, the daily summary. It is not a narrative, not a story, merely a compression of numbers into a final rigid shape. You list conditions as stable. You list supplies as adequate. You list weather as consistent. Nowhere does the book ask whether the men are tired or whether the air in the hold felt heavier than usual. Nowhere does it permit reflection. You sign the entry with the same small flourish you always allow, a simple initial, barely more elaborate than a stroke. It is the only place in the book where your hand reveals itself as human. Every number is anonymous, but the signature ties you to the accuracy of the record. You wonder briefly whether accuracy is ever enough, then close the thought as quickly as it surfaces. The ledger does not welcome wonder. You close the book gently, feeling the weight of it settle into your hands. The silence around you feels different now. Not deeper, but clearer. The world beyond the log is unchanged, yet the act of writing separates you from it, carving a small chamber of quiet in which the ship's motions become abstract. You place the logbook back in its secure drawer, sliding it into the darkness, where it will rest until the next hour asks for another set of measurements. When you stand, the deck creaks faintly, acknowledging your shift from stillness to movement. The sun presses through a thinning bank of clouds, scattering pale light across the boards. You step back into the work of the day, carrying with you only the small echo of ink drying in silence, an echo swallowed quickly by the rhythms that define the ship's long measured journey. You leave the logbook where it rests, its pages settling into stillness, and the quiet around you feels momentarily wider. The deck stretches open, washed in a faint, colourless light that softens every edge. You move without haste, following no explicit order, only the subtle pull of routine that guides your steps along the planks. The rail draws you as it often does, not for the view, which rarely changes, but for the way the sea offers a steady, indifferent mirror when the wind calms enough for the surface to lie flat. The ship glides through a patch of water where the swells have settled into long, shallow breaths. You pause there, both hands resting on the worn wood of the rail. The grain has been smoothed by countless palms, leaving it polished in places, splintered in others. The sea below reflects the world in muted fragments. Sky, hull, a passing shadow of canvas, and then, through a brief lull in the motion, your own face appears in the dim surface. It is not a sharp reflection. The water blurs and stretches your features, softening the corners of your jaw, thinning your mouth into a straight, expressionless line. Still, the gaze that looks back at you has a familiarity you cannot ignore. There is a calmness in it, though not the kind born of peace, more the kind pressed into you through repetition, through days measured in tasks rather than thoughts. A face worn down not by crisis, but by the slow abrasion of routine. You study it for a moment, aware of how rarely you allow yourself to observe rather than record. The eyes staring back seem older than they should be, though age aboard a ship like this is not counted in years. It is counted in watch shifts, in rations measured and delivered, in the weight of numbers inked into ledgers. You trace the faint hollows beneath them, the way the light turns your cheek flat, the set of your jaw that no longer changes even when you try to relax it. Something stirs behind the gaze, a small ripple of recognition, or memory, or presence. It feels fragile, as if it had waited for an unguarded moment to surface. Not quite emotion, not quite awareness, but something human that has not yet been reshaped entirely by the work that governs your days. The sea shifts, and the reflection breaks apart, dissolving into dark ripples. You exhale slowly, not disappointed exactly, but aware the moment is already fading. It is rare, and its rarity makes it almost unwelcome. Awareness is not a resource the ship encourages you to spend. A crewmate crosses behind you, his steps measured, purposeful. He carries a coil of rope against his shoulder, strands brushing his sleeve like loose hair. He does not speak, but his presence trims the edges of your thoughts, nudging you back toward the demands of the deck. His movement is a reminder, a soft, practical interruption, that work continues whether or not you pause at the rail. You adjust your grip on the wood and watch the water resume its restless motion. The surface dims again, the brief clarity replaced with a wavering confusion of reflected sky and shadow. The ship's wake forms a long foaming line behind it, the pattern consistent, almost deliberate. You follow it with your eyes until it disappears into the blur of distance. You shift your stance, feeling the deck answer your weight. The boards creak with an old familiarity, as though your presence is just another rhythm in their long record of footsteps. The wind brushes your cheek, carrying with it the smell of tar and damp canvas. You turn your head slightly, letting the currents of air interact with the small space of calm your reflection had opened inside you. Another wave rises, breaking against the hull with a soft, exhausted thud. The resonance vibrates up through your hands and into your arms, grounding your attention. You look down again, but now the surface is fractured, your image torn into strands by the wake. The moment for introspection has passed. The ship does not linger on such things, and neither can you afford to. A voice calls your name, not harsh, not urgent, just a simple directive, spoken in the same flat tone you've heard 100 times before. You lift your head and answer, stepping away from the rail. The echo of your reflection remains faintly in your mind, but duty applies pressure until it compresses into something smaller, easier to ignore. As you walk, you feel the mask of routine settle back into place. Your pace aligns automatically with the rhythm of the deck, steady and unremarkable. The world returns to its measurements: distance to the bow, angle of the sails, the hum of tension in the rigging. Everything slots neatly back into the structure you know, but a trace of the moment remains. Not enough to alter your actions, not enough to distract you from the next responsibility, yet present enough to mark a slight shift inside you. It is like a whisper lodged beneath the ribs, a reminder that somewhere, beneath the layers of compliance and method, something still recognizes itself. You move toward the crew clustered near the mainmast. They do not look at you long. Their attention is already divided, absorbed by knots to tighten, weights to check, commands to relay. You join them seamlessly, your hands finding their role without prompting. The work covers you like a second skin. Rope passes through your fingers, wood meets metal. The ship aches and adjusts. You help repair a pulley, the worn groove replaced with a smoother one. Someone mutters a measurement, and you confirm it with a nod. The tasks settle into your limbs, familiar and precise. A breeze lifts the edge of your shirt, carrying off whatever residue remained from the reflection you saw earlier. Not erasing it entirely, but dispersing it, softening it into something manageable. The human stirring fades to a faint pulse, steady but suppressed, and you feel yourself slide cleanly back into the machinery of the day. You do not resent this feeling. It is part of the life you occupy, a narrowing of thought that allows your hands and mind to remain functional. Too much awareness disrupts the flow, too much feeling clogs the gears. The ship demands steadiness, and steadiness requires stillness inside you. Later, when your hands pause for a brief moment between tasks, you glance once more toward the rail. The sea is moving again, restless and opaque, No reflection waits for you now. Only the endless surface, folding and unfolding, patience as time itself. You turn back to the work, letting the rhythm take hold. The ship moves forward, the crew moves with it, and you move with them, absorbed again into the cycle that shapes each hour. The glimpse you caught remains behind you, like a faint footprint on wet sand. Visible only briefly, quickly erased, yet evidence that something human exists beneath the roles you serve. You stand once more at the rail, fingers resting on the familiar worn wood, and let your eyes follow the clean seam where water and sky meet. The line runs straight and unperturbed, indifferent to the small variations of wind and current that pull the ship along. It offers no landmarks, only distance reduced to a single, patient border. Watching it becomes a way of measuring time without numbers, a slow, blanking repetition that smooths 1 hour into the next until the notion of day itself flattens beneath the weight of routine. The light shifts with a patience that has nothing theatrical about it. Mornings arrive as a faint increase in clarity. Evenings settle in like a muted cloth laid over the world. The sun's passage is less an event than a change in tone. You notice it more as practical information than as weather. A warmer angle that will bake the ropes dry. A dimmer one that will stiffen joints and convene repairs. The horizon never offers surprises. It simply extends and accepts whatever the ship brings into its fold. You move along the deck as though following a script etched in your body. Each step is unremarkable and precise. Hands find tasks without deliberation, coiling, measuring, notarizing. Your days have become an accumulation of such small acts, each folded into the next, until they create a garment of motion you wear without thinking. The repetition is not oppressive so much as stabilizing. It keeps the world legible and the vessel intact. Conversations that do occur are transactions in utility. Men exchange brief facts. Windward, lee, spare sail, with a tone as dry as rope. There is no indulgence in storytelling here. The ship's needs compress speech into the smallest useful unit. When someone mentions a shore visited long ago, he speaks in coordinates and dates rather than memories, rendering even memory an element of work. You learn to savour silence between these exchanges, not for its comfort, but because it allows tasks their most efficient shape. The ship itself becomes an instrument of boredom and clarity combined. Repetition sharpens skills, it blunts sentiment. You have an aptitude for noticing slippages, a line that has loosened after weeks of tautness, a barrel whose weight has decreased imperceptibly. These small variations are the ship's grammar. They are the clues that keep its language intelligible. You catalogue them as you would catalogue provisions, and in that cataloguing you find a kind of authority that shelters you from the ineffable elements you otherwise would have to name. Days accumulate without punctuation. You keep the ledger, always nearby, in case a figure must be recorded immediately. Water levels, rations, repairs. Entries pile into columns and then into pages. Pages fold into volumes. The volumes sit like a ledgered history of endurance, an institutional memory that refuses drama and accepts only facts. The absence of flourish in those pages is a kind of mercy. It spares you the obligation to narrate suffering and to make sense of it beyond what is strictly necessary. Work becomes the scaffolding upon which the hours hang. When the sun is high, heavy tasks are chosen. When it slants low, mending and inventory fill the gaps. The day's architecture is capable of being explained in a few terse terms, because each action naturally leads to the next. Tighten here, replace there, note the change. No single moment claims primacy. Everything shares the same weight. This levelling makes it easier to move through the hours without surprise or accumulation of anxiety. You find sometimes that the ship's slow drift has a numbing quality that is nearly pleasant. There is a steadiness to it, an assurance that the world remains readable if you apply the same measures consistently. The ocean's motion provides a metronome. Your breathing, your hands, your thoughts gradually align with it. In that alignment, the ship becomes less a burden and more a machine that transforms chaos into order through repetitive action. The transformation is pragmatic, not moral. It does not salve conscience, it simply keeps the vessel running. Occasionally, you mark small variations against habit. A gull that lingers longer over the stern than seems usual. The distant curl of a smoke plume where fishermen might be. A shift in current that makes the helm require a slightly altered hand. These anomalies are catalogued and stored for later comparison, items to consult if the pattern changes again. The act of noting them does not provoke wonder. It produces a readiness, a provisional planning that feels professional rather than curious. Given enough days, the ship's world folds inward. The map of familiar lines, the mast, the capstan, the galley door, grows precise in the mind. You can find any implement by touch. You can judge the condition of a rope by the sound it makes when it slides through your fingers. This sensory precision is not the product of affection, but of functional necessity. Still, it develops into a quiet intimacy, a knowledge of how the deck answers underfoot, how a knot should sit, how the rigging hums when the wind grows insistent. There are moments when the sameness makes your own movements feel as if they belong to someone else. You watch a hand perform a splice, and for a beat you might think it is not yours, that some other person is living the life you have been assigned. The thought is brief and managed. You do not pursue identity in a place where duties clarify, being more usefully than introspection. The ship's logic favours utility over existential speculation. You keep an eye on the people around you, as though they were parts of the ship's apparatus. A man's gait tells you about his energy reserves. The way a youth hesitates with a block reveals his lack of experience. You make small practical allowances, assign lighter tasks, show a quicker knot, swap a shift. These are not acts of charity as much as adjustments to maintain the system. The machine runs smoother when its parts are cared for according to need. Meals punctuate the day with a ritual that strips them of ceremony. The routine of distribution and returning bowls flattens hunger into counting and conserves energy by reducing expectation. The simplicity of the acts surrounding food, measure, serve, record, removes the possibility of surprise. This economy is comforting in its predictability. Meals become as reassuring as any gear that functions when it is supposed to. Time, measured in the ship's terms, is not a forward arrow, but a set of concentric circles. Each day resembles the last, and still the redundancy reveals new detail. The rate of evaporation from a cask, the way tar beads on a particular plank, the softening of canvas in a certain sunlight. You document these subtleties because the accumulation of small differences eventually shapes significant decisions. In this way, monotony becomes a method of detection. The horizon remains impartial. It neither judges nor consoles. If you look at it long enough, its emptiness offers a kind of solace, the reassurance that no drama will surprise you for reasons other than the ship's own predictable needs. You do not romanticize the line. You use it as a tool for orientation, a way of aligning the ship's course with a mental map that helps you sleep in shifts and wake prepared. Evening brings a mild contraction of activity. Hands move more carefully. Voices lower further. The deck gathers itself, laying ropes and spars into their slower positions. The watch rotations are assigned, and you slip into your appointed hours with the familiarity of a soldier taking position along a silent parapet. The night will demand inspection and patience. Day will demand labour and endurance. Both are obligations you accept without complaint, because acceptance costs little and sustains much. You sometimes catch a glimpse of the far-off shore on the mind's edge, its possibility, a shape you could imagine in idle hours. But these figments are practiced away quickly. The ship has little patience for flights of fancy. Practical plans, not dreams, preserve the voyage. The person you are aboard this vessel is a person of measures and margins, of lists and careful adjustments. The role simplifies choices and narrows opportunities for error. In that narrowing, there is a strange kind of clarity. Decisions become fewer and more precise. The world reduces itself to a set of manageable variables. You spend your days moving through these variables with a competence that feels quietly stabilizing. The slow drift of the vessel and the blind repetition of the hours conspire to make you efficient at preserving the things that keep it afloat. So you continue watching the horizon as if it were a clock without hands, moving from one task to the next in a procession of small completions. The days fold into one another with the soft inevitability of stitched pages. The ship carries you along, not toward spectacle, but toward the next practical requirement. Your life condenses into this measured labour, and within it you find a kind of endurance that answers nothing and asks nothing, only that you remain present enough to do what must be done. You move along the deck with the steady pace the day has carved into you, senses tuned more to pattern than to surprise. The horizon stretches unbroken, the sea lifts and settles in its patient rhythm, and the ship carries itself with the slow persistence of something long resigned to endurance. It feels as though time has arranged itself into a wide, repetitive tide, one that pushes you gently forward through familiar motions. Yet even within this sameness, small shifts accumulate, subtle changes you detect, not through alarm, but through the fine adjustments your hands and eyes have learned to make. A faint difference in scent rising through the grates, a longer pause between the muffled movements below, a quality to the air that seems heavier, less cooperative. These things do not interrupt the day, they simply edge into it, waiting to be categorized and absorbed into the ship's ongoing arithmetic. You take the lantern and descend the narrow ladder without expectation. The heat greets you first, thicker than on previous mornings, its weight settling across your shoulders like an added layer. The familiar darkness pulls in the corners of the hold, but something in it feels rearranged. Not profoundly, not dramatically, just shifted enough that your instincts lean forward, attentive. People stir in slow motions, their bodies adjusting to the cramped world they cannot leave. Voices do not rise. No one calls out, yet the silence carries a new density, as if breaths are being held longer, as if sleep and waking have blurred into a single kind of exhaustion. You take in the scene not as a tableau of suffering, but as data, reduced movement, altered airflow, increased humidity. Each observation clicks into place with the calm detachment that duty demands. The steward arrives beside you, his lantern casting a broader glow that reveals more detail. He does not speak, he merely tilts his chin, a signal that the procedures must shift to accommodate the changing conditions. The two of you begin your work without discussion. Conversation has no function here. Its absence preserves energy and clarity. You move through the rows, adjusting spacing by inches where possible, shifting small bundles of belongings to improve the channel of air along the central corridor. Your hands guide quietly, not touching more than necessary, but establishing new boundaries where bodies must sit or lean. The changes are neither comforting nor cruel. They are logistical responses to the altered environment, revisions to the system rather than attempts to ease what cannot be eased. A man near the far bulkhead coughs, a sound lower and more repetitive than before. You note the direction and the frequency, passing the information to the steward with a short nod. He kneels beside the man, checking pulse and skin temperature with the efficiency of someone who has done so too many times to soften his movements. A cloth is pressed to a forehead. A few drops of water moisten cracked lips. The actions occur in silence, their meaning shrunk to procedure. You continue onward, measuring the rhythm of breaths in the cramped space. The angle at which heads rest, the slight trembling of hands clutching wooden bowls. These details do not pierce you emotionally. They record themselves through a practice filter. The ship has trained you to process suffering into categories: mild, severe, worsening, stabilized. Human shapes converted into a kind of internal ledger that informs the next small adjustment. Someone gestures toward a cask that has shifted during the night. Its new position narrows the walkway, affecting airflow and access. You mark it mentally, then shoulder the weight until it moves back into alignment with the others. The scrape of wood on wood is loud in the compressed space, but it is a reassuring sound, one that affirms the ship's architecture is still within the limits of control. The steward whispers a number, indicating a change in ration distribution for the next cycle. You record it on your slate. The change is minimal, but necessary. Increased heat means increased thirst, and the allotments must reflect that reality. With an economy that borders on arithmetic cruelty, you do not decide how much each person receives. You implement. The distinction matters only in that it allows you to continue functioning. The air thickens as more bodies wake, and you adjust your breathing to avoid dizziness. The lantern flickers, as if struggling in the humidity, casting unstable shadows that sway with each motion of the ship. You kneel to inspect the grates along the lower planks, clearing debris that has accumulated and prevented adequate ventilation. Your fingers brush through dirt, bits of cloth, hardened residue that must be removed to keep the air circulating. Simple tasks, precise hands repeated countless times. A child shifts weakly near one of the support beams. The steward approaches and gestures for you to assist. You do so immediately, lifting the child just enough to reposition her so her breathing has more room. The body is light, too light, yet the ledger in your mind notes the change, not as tragedy but as a metric. Strength reduced, needs increased, watch closely. You hold her for only a second, long enough to complete the adjustment, then return her to the small blanket that serves as a barrier between body and plank. You slide the lantern along the floor to inspect the corners for pooled moisture. The hold collects water slowly, almost imperceptibly, through seams and condensation. Too much dampness risks illness, rot, imbalance. You mop the small accumulation with a rag, marking the source with a piece of chalk for later repair. The task is simple, the significance purely structural. When you rise again, the steward gives a brief, nearly invisible gesture. It means the adjustments are complete for now. Procedures have been updated, airflow improved, positions corrected, resources marked for redistribution. Nothing has changed in a transformative way. Nothing has improved enough to call it relief. But the balance has been recalibrated, and that is what the ship requires. You ascend the ladder slowly, aware of how the cool air hits your skin like a thin, unexpected kindness. The deck feels lighter, not because anything has eased, but because the hold's density no longer compresses your lungs. You blink into the daylight, adjusting to the wider space, the cleaner air, the broader sounds. Above, the crew continues their routines with the same quiet steadiness. A man repairs a torn scrap of sail. Another checks the angle of the helm. No one asks what occurred below, not out of apathy, but because the rhythms above and below are separate engines of the same machine. Their tasks depend on your adjustments, just as yours depend on theirs. Each is a cog in the broader indifferent process. You set your slate on the table near the mast and enter the new numbers into the log. The changes appear small on the page. A few notations, a slight revision in ration distribution, a brief commentary on airflow and condition. Yet these tiny lines carry the weight of dozens of lives compressed into the ship's narrow underbelly. The ink dries without flourish. The book accepts the updates without judgment. The day stretches outward, its shape unchanged, its demands persistent. The routine absorbs the revision, as though it had anticipated it all along. Nothing breaks, nothing resolves. The ship continues forward, through a world of water and wind, unperturbed by the microscopic shifts within its hull. You breathe in, steady and even. The adjustment is complete. The process continues. Nothing more. The dusk you watched from the rail slides thinner now, a narrow bar of orange along the western rim that the sea seems intent on keeping subdued. The ship's outline sharpens against the dimming light, and in that sharpening you feel the world fold towards something that resembles an ending. Not loud, not celebratory, only a tightening of attention, in the way a hand tightens on a rope when a turn is coming. Your motions remain the same, measured, economical, practiced. The approaching coast enters your awareness as another datum to be recorded and acted upon. You move through your duties with the same steadiness that shaped every hour before. Lines are checked, lanterns readied, the helm's set confirmed and reconfirmed. Each task is performed without flourish. Inspection, notation, minor correction, because the machinery of the ship cannot be trusted to guess what must be done. You rely on procedure. Your fingers know what to test. Your eyes know where to linger. Anticipation sits in the margins of your mind like a faint note, not loud enough to displace the ledgered work, but present enough to sharpen your focus. The crew itself tightens in small, imperceptible ways. Steps are a degree quicker, nods are a touch firmer. Men who usually move with an economy of motion now tuck away tools a little more deliberately. Check knots as if imagining a future where they will need to be irreproachable. Adjust coils until their lines lay perfect on the deck. There is no cheering. There is no talk of home. Instead, there is a concentration that reads as professionalism, work intensified by the nearness of change. Below, whatever atmosphere has been recalibrated in earlier hours keeps its weight, but the steward's notes come more frequently now. You shift between decks with a quickness that borders on impatience, not yours so much as the ship's, an urgent insistence from the timbers that something will alter and your hands must be ready. You pass the hold, lantern casting, a thin column of light through the grates, and feel the small, persistent presence of the cargo as a pressure at your ribs. It is a constant force, neither spoken about nor ignored. It simply exists within the equations you maintain. Orders filter down in clipped phrases. Short and top gallant, an officer calls, voice flat and businesslike. Rig the landing ropes, prepare the longboat. There is a precision in these commands that mirrors the ledger's measurements. They demand responses counted in actions. Furl, secure, test, repeat. You do not rise to excitement. You apply method. The ship's tasks require no emotion, only accuracy. The wind shifts slightly as the coastline's unseen contours begin to influence the air. You notice it in the tiny way the canvas breathes. At first a whisper, then a clearer pull. Your hand moves to adjust a sheet. The knot bites your palm, and you ease it into a different angle. Every minute correction feels like a note in a long, careful composition. The sea itself seems to draw closer, not with drama, but with the steady contraction of distance. You check the log frequently now, adding bearings and estimated distances. The ink flowing into columns that will later be consulted by those whose responsibilities extend beyond yours. Each number is both a record and a promise. Latitude, longitude, wind force, sail set. The book makes the future legible in small units. It does not comfort you. It makes the unknown manageable by turning it into a form you can manipulate. At times you pause and listen to the ship itself. The hull emits a low, articulate chorus, a series of groans and sighs that speak of strain, but also of endurance. You have learned to interpret these sounds as you interpret the gasps from below decks, signals to be noted and addressed. A plank that complains is inspected, a bolt that hums is tightened. The work is not heroic, it is patient and exacting. It is the kind of labour that keeps the vessel intact enough to reach the shore. Nearer to dusk, the longboat is swung out and tested. Men haul at blocks, checking the line's play. The fall of the oarlocks, the neatness of the seating. The boat rocks against its strops with a steady, reassuring thud. You run your hands along its gunnels and note the small repairs it will need if it meets rough water. A splintered thwart, a seam that requires pitch. You mark these items in your mind not as complaints, but as scheduled tasks, necessary entries in the ship's catalogue of readiness. The crew prepares for the landing quietly. There is a choreography to the work. Men assigned to rope, men assigned to oars, men assigned to watch for any sign that a shore's approach might bring trouble. The manner of it is composed. It resembles an apparatus being set for operation. Your place in the choreography is familiar and finite. You check the lashings, confirm the number of spare lines, calibrate the small leather buckets meant to bail water should the longboat take on spray. As night lowers, the outline of land becomes a suggestion rather than a clarity. Darkness punctuated by the faint scatter of lights that might be fires along the shore or other signallers. Distance contracts and expands in the ambiguity of dusk, and you weigh the possibilities as if they were measurements on a scale. Any uncertainty is reduced through routine. Observe, note, adjust. The world yields to systems you can act upon. You notice a certain economy of speech when small talk arises, a brief comment on the angle of the wind, a clipped remark about tides. Personal history is traded rarely and curtly. Names and facts pass like tools. One man mentions a harbour he briefly saw years ago, and his voice is matter of fact. No yearning, no softening. The tone on board now is small and restrained, focus maintained, distractions minimised. There is a subtle restlessness in the hold as well. The grates vibrate in a way that communicates expectation. Men shift positions and wait with a particular posture that suggests readiness rather than impatience. The steward comes and goes through the hatch with brief orders and small reassurances. A cloth dampened here, a bowl prepared there, a blanket readied. His gestures are economical and functional. He smooths the world into operation. You feel the ledger's authority most sharply now. Numbers decide the sequence of actions. How many men can be spared to the longboat? How many remain to tend the sails? The rations set aside for the immediate hours that will follow landfall. There is an explicit logic to these decisions, a calculus that converts the human into manageable terms. You do not like the conversion, and you do not resist it. You accept it as the language necessary for survival aboard. The night deepens, lantern-like pools, and is banked against the dark with careful angles so as not to advertise the ship's position unnecessarily. Shadows move long and soft across the deck as tasks continue beneath the small, precise illumination. Hands become silhouettes performing necessary actions without spectacle. You move among them, a part of the silent mechanism, making sure each piece will carry its load when the moment arrives. When the officer finally calls for the longboat to be lowered in readiness, the response is swift and composed. Lines that were coiled for months are loosened and tested. Blocks sing with practiced ease. Men take their stations with the sort of detachment required to do the dangerous and necessary without creating panic. You watch the boat swing slowly, its shape cut darkly against the dim scatter of shore lights. Your notes reflect the sequence: time, wind angle, number of hands, condition of the oars. There is a peculiar calm in that moment, a tightness like the held breath before a bell rings. It is not excitement, rather it is a concentration so complete that it erases the softer edges of thought. The ship and crew condense into duty. Your hands steady the last line, your ink dries on the ledger, and everything prepares for the transition that will convert movement into arrival. You do not imagine the shore as home. You think of it as the next phase of work, the task continuing under a different sky. Your role does not change in its essence. If anything, it sharpens. The numbers will shift, the ledger will expand, new entries will demand attention. The ship's burdens will be transferred in sequence, ropes, steps, the adjustment of weight, and you will be part of the measured process that accomplishes it. The long night persists, heavy with readiness and thin with expectation. Your watch continues, your pen moves, your hands prepare. In the small details, not tucked cleanly, or positioned just so, lantern trimmed to hold its flame long, you find the form of assurance the sea allows. The approach to land will be one more operation to be performed with the procedural calm that has carried you across days. You hold that calm as the world outside tightens its contours and the ship creaks beneath the weight of what is coming. The shore manifests itself slowly, as if someone behind the curtains were drawing them aside in careful increments rather than pulling them away at once. A darker band appears where the horizon had been pale. Then a line of trees asserts itself, a darker tooth along the horizon. The lights you thought might be fires take shape as scattered lamps near a landing. The ship changes tone, not loudly, not with celebration, but with the visible tightening of purpose. You feel it in the boards beneath your feet as the hull takes on the precise angles called for by shallow water and careful approach. You stand where you have stood so many times before, hands on the rail, ledger at your side, tools within reach. There is nothing theatrical in your preparations. You check the lashings, measure the fall of the lines once more, and confirm the order of the longboat's lowering. Each action is a small ritual of competence, each knot retied, each block tested, each oar oiled until it will not bite the hand that grips it. The longboat itself swings steady, its shape familiar and flat against the dark. Men climb into it with motions that suggest muscle memory more than hope. Above the deck, commands move in clipped phrases. The officer issues them with the same flatness that has governed the ship's days. Quick, efficient, precise. Secure the keel rope. Lower the lee anchor. Prepare the gangline. You execute the words as if transcribing an accounting entry. No tremor, no emphasis, only the translation of instruction into movement. The ship's business is a ledger of tasks. Landfall is merely a new column to be filed. You notice the edges of men's faces under the lantern light. They are set, measured, largely unreadable. There is no cheering. There is only the weight of tasks completed and the knowledge that new tasks will follow at once. Each man understands his role. Some to handle the small boats, some to stow sails against shore winds, some to secure the hatches. The division of labour is efficient and unemotional, method replacing story. Below, the hold shifts in its own way. The grates and slats that have been barriers and filters become portals for movement. Voices that had been suppressed or muffled find a little more space to travel, and a certain restlessness stirs in measured increments. You feel that shift not as sympathy, but as information. You log its presence in the margin of your mind, while your hands continue the necessary work above. The men below adjust their posture, as if aligning themselves to a new architecture of motion, preparing to be moved, to be sorted, to be made ready for whatever comes next. The longboat reaches the water with the slow, inevitable grace of something designed to deliver weight safely. Men lower it by the blocks with careful, practiced slowness. Each pull is measured, each tagline eased in a controlled cadence. You watch the chain of motions like one studies a machine coming to full operation. No surprises, no improvisations, only a sequence of correctives that convert the ship's potential into action. You stand by the gangline as the first small party moves toward the shore. Their faces are veiled in the marginal light, features flattened into the shapes required by purpose. They step into the longboat, secure themselves, and begin the labour of oaring toward land. The sound of the oars is a low, regular count that blends with the ship's own creaks and the whisper of water against hull. It is a sound of work continuing seamlessly in a new register. On deck, the work is bureaucratic and physical in equal measure. Lines are run out, anchors readied, crates inventoried, and tagged for transfer. You mark each item methodically, call out weights and numbers as if moving volumes of grain from one ledger to another. The cargo below is likewise prepared, strapped, inspected, catalogued. The ship performs this transfer without moral language. It performs it because it must. The procedure reduces complexity to manageable units, and in those units you act. The shoreline approaches in increments measured by the depth sounder and the length of the tide. You check both and make notes indicating when the captain will order the final approach. There is a precision to this waiting, not anticipation as emotion, but as timing, an awareness of the small window in which everything must align to avoid grounding or loss. The sea presses the vessel forward. You temper that pressure with lines and angles and weight. The process is exacting, and exactitude steadies your hands. When the call comes to beach the longboat, men leap into place with the quick, practiced motions that minimize risk. The oars meet sand. The boat noses forward. The first footwear touches shore. You remain on deck to oversee the securing of the ship, performing checks with deliberate thoroughness. Lashings are doubled, the anchor rechecked, spare boats kept ready. Your ledger collects times and notes as if the world were a page to be filled. There is no triumphant note as the quayside appears. People on shore move with their own economy. Harvesters, porters, small figures, who will perform their own roles in the ledgers, you and the officers will complete. They are not characters in some imagined drama. They are elements in a procedure that will convert the ship's burden into another configuration. You move among them with that same procedural eye, measuring the distance of steps, checking the readiness of jetties, noting the light cast by torches that will guide men later. The transfer begins and proceeds with a cold efficiency. Crates are lowered and received. Ropes are held taut and then eased. Men descend into the hold with lanterns, passing packages or fastening tags. You observe the motions and note the small practical problems. A lash needing reinforcement, a lantern failing and replaced, a crate that must be adjusted to remove slack. Each intervention is quick and necessary. Each is born of competence rather than reflection. At the centre of the work is the conversion of bodies into items on lists. You watch as men move through the hatch, their hands given short instructions, and return to the surface with hands that carry marks. Identity here is reduced, a name scratched into a tally, a mark beside a number indicating condition or status. The ship's systems assert themselves, folding people into inventories with the same clinical steadiness with which they fold sails and food. Your pen captures the entries, your hand moves with the ink, your signature validates. There are moments when a glance meets a face and something passes between two human beings that is not part of the ledger, an instant of connection that the procedure cannot account for. It is brief and fragile, a look that acknowledges the awful smallness of the life they now occupy, a hand that lingers a second too long on another's shoulder before practical motion removes it. These moments are not celebrated, they are noted inwardly and then swallowed back into the broader system, like a fly caught and discarded by the machines in different gears. The shore's demands do not ease your workload, they transform it. You find yourself cataloguing a new set of variables, the timing of tide windows, the capacity of jetties, the terms of local handlers. These are not moral questions, but logistical ones. How many men are needed to move a crate across wet sand? What sequence will prevent congestion at the landing? How to balance quick transfer with careful accounting? The ship's imperative is clear. Move the cargo, preserve the vessel, maintain order. Even as the longboat empties and returns for the next load, the night continues its soft, relentless work of observation and recording. You note the time each sortie begins and ends, the condition of each man as he steps ashore, and as he returns, the slight changes in weather that might complicate later runs. Your entries pile up not in dramatics, but in numbers and short comments. They are the quiet proof that systems were upheld, that the work was done. When the last of the scheduled loads is taken, the ship remains alive with a different sort of motion. Men who had spent days confined are now moved, handed off, transferred into other hands, into jetties, into quarters by the shore, into markets, or into the care of agents who will process them further. You watch the conversions happen with the same cool attention you have brought to knots and sails. The world operates on its own efficiencies. You are an agent of them. There is no relief for you in the completion. The ledger closes in a way that feels thinly ceremonial. Signatures, receipts, a final tally of weights and numbers. You mark them off with the same small flourish that always marks completion. Your hand grows tired, but not from exertion, rather from the procession of decisions that reduce fuller lives into terse entries. The pen feels heavier as ink dries into the book, the page absorbing the day's transactions with patient silence. When the men who will remain aboard for the onward voyage prepare the decks, the atmosphere resumes its steadier, more familiar rhythm. Ropes are coiled, sails secured, ballast rechecked. You follow the procedures with a quiet, composed thoroughness. The ship's work is never truly done. Each completion is immediately the beginning of another sequence. You close the ledger and place it in its drawer. Your finger lingers a second on the worn binding, feeling the dent of repeated signatures. The night is deeper now, and the shore's lamps burn steady. You breathe in the humid air, tasting tar and salt and the faint smell of shore smoke. There is no triumphant note on your tongue, no promise of rest. There is only the recognition that one task has ended and another will begin. Not in drama, but in the patient arithmetic of duty. You stand on the deck until the last lights on the shore dim into the distance, watching the line of land shrink back into the horizon. The ship settles into its new balance, and you into your continuing role. There is no ceremony in your deliverance, only the tight, precise completion of what had been required. The work is done, and yet the world insists. More work follows, lists expand, ink must dry again. You turn away from the rail and step toward the small, warm pocket of the crew, toward the next page, the next entry, the next quietly necessary task. The night carries on as it always has, steady and unopinionated, and you move with it. Methodical, drained, necessary. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S., Rich Davis, and Leslie Schofield. Sleep well.